as that gets started. Okay, and now I've got the pleasure of introducing Marci and Cassandra. Marci has held various leadership roles with Adoption Knowledge Affiliates since 2014, including board president and executive director. She's an adoptee, and she's also proud of her time on the board of Support Texas Adoptee Rights. She's currently a member of their advisory board. Marci is committed to reform and social change relating to the rights of adult adoptees and foster care alumni, as well as truth and transparency in all aspects of adoption. Cassandra Adams is a late discovery sperm donor conceived person dedicated to raising awareness of issues surrounding donor conception. Her focus includes educating parents on best practices and advancing legislative changes for reforming the fertility industry, in addition to writing, speaking, and other creative outlets, which we are one of being here this evening. She explores the ethics of donor conception, the emotional impact, and the trauma of late discovery, and the complexities of ethnicity changes. As I said, you can put questions in the chat anytime, and with that, I will hand it over to Marci and Cassandra. Thanks.
Thanks, Betsy. I'm so honored to be here. I'm especially excited to be here with Cassandra.
Thank you so much for having us. This is so exciting to be here.
So I guess we were going to jump in and just sort of tell, Betsy had brought us together because she saw that we had gathered. Cassandra and I had met up in New Jersey and I'd posted some photos, and I think Betsy was intrigued, like, oh, wow, those are two different from two different communities, but hanging out at the Jersey Shore. So I was super excited to connect with Cassandra on social media as our two communities started converging over the past, I would say, like 5 years maybe. This slow convergence has been happening, and I was super excited. I think either I friended Cassandra or she friended me, and I was seeing her posting all these familiar places because I was originally born and raised very near to where Cassandra lives. So I was just enjoying following her in that regard, and then also in just seeing the updates of what was happening in the donor conceived community and on Cassandra's personal journey. And then fortunately, our schedules aligned, and we were able to connect last summer in New Jersey in person. And it's it was as it is for so many adoptees, and I'm sure donor conceived people as well, where we just immediately started talking and just really drawing on all the parallels of our experiences, and just felt at least I felt very validated in the sharing of our stories.
It's always, you say something and it's, oh my gosh, me too, us too. Oh, that's so similar for my community as it is for you guys. It's extremely validating. And Marci was an amazing, gracious host. I brought my young daughter with me, and she was fabulous. And so it was just a beautiful day together. And I love connecting with anyone who's on this journey or a similar journey, because there's always so much to talk about. And that's kind of what sparked this discussion tonight, is that we just had so much to talk about, where it was a constant understanding of one another, and a constant, even if we didn't quite get something that was different between our two communities, just a desire to understand it, to explain it, and be understood. And so I think we all have a passion for wanting our communities to understand one another more, so that we can help one another more and just support one another. And so that's really what we would love to do tonight, is just talk about some of those parallels and some of those differences, and how that has helped us to not only become friends with one another, but to support one another's communities.
Yeah, and I mean, full disclosure, I would say that the fact that I had a DNA discovery within my biological family definitely helped us connect. I think even, and that's true for so many American families now anyway, but I definitely feel like that helped me connect even further. You know, having discovered that my grandfather that I had reunited with wasn't my biological grandfather, and then that I had these 30 first cousins that I didn't know I had, and 11 aunts and uncles. So that DNA discovery piece, it does add an additional level of understanding. And like I said, for so many adoptees, using DNA, I was actually already done with my reunion, I thought. So my DNA testing was just for fun and to help other adoptees, but lo and behold, I had my own discovery. So that was also, I think, fuel for our conversation. And I know that there's probably a lot of folks in the room that can identify with that too. It's like an additional layer of connection, understanding that. And you had
Yeah,
mentioned in your bio the ethnicity piece. And that was a huge connection for us, right? Like growing up thinking you're one ethnicity and then finding out, oh, wait a minute, no, that's not the case.
exactly. And for those who don't know as much about my backstory, I have known for 5 years that I'm donor conceived. I found out through a DNA test. It was a secret that my parents were planning to take to the grave, until a recreational DNA test with 23andMe. And the fact that the first glaring thing about my results was that I was 50% of an ethnicity that I had completely not expected, and then matched with relatives that I did not know. It was a big shock, and I think it's one of those things that you kind of have to live through in order to kind of understand the mess it creates in your life and in your head and in your spirit, because it's just crazy. And to experience that shift in your ethnic background is also very disorienting in life, and it leads to an extra layer of grief because you missed out on being a part of a community that you should have been a part of your whole life. And I know that that's the ever-present feeling of adoptees as well. Not only missing out on a culture that you should have been growing up in, but missing out on a family that you should have grown up in as well. So it was just layers upon layers of understanding these concepts.
That's really well put and so true. Like that ethnicity piece was big for me. And I have to say, like growing up in New Jersey and always having someone say to you, oh, what, oh, your last name, it's, you know, what is that? Oh, that's German. Are you German? And, you know, people think, oh, what's the big deal? You know, but it is a big deal. And always being reminded that you're adopted, and then come to find out that you're not even the ethnicity that you were told you were when you were growing up. So I think that that's a really common experience among adoptees and also donor conceived. I was just reading a post that I really agreed with wholeheartedly, and that was talking about how it was saying, unless you're adopted, don't assume that you know what the adoption experience is like. But what I found really refreshing was that, Cassandra, you did not try to say, I know exactly what the adoption experience is like. And I don't think I, did that to you, but yet we still found so many parallels, and more so than I found in any other community. So although there still are very unique experiences in and of themselves, I feel there is more overlap in our two communities than in so many others that might even claim to have a similarity to adoption. It does feel like our two communities do align on a lot of these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I think two of the biggest factors that make our communities so similar, that kind of differentiate us from some other communities, are the issues of commodification, the industries that, you know, the adoption industry and the fertility industry are often driven by providing a product for people who want that product. And I think it's very hard for other people to understand what it's like to have a price tag attached to your existence, or a price tag attached to your family, you know, which family you have, or a price tag attached to losing your ethnic background. And the other issue, I think, is the issue of gratitude, forced gratitude, feeling like you need to be grateful either for existing, or for the fact that your family took you in. Anything that people kind of weaponize to use against us, which is, they weaponize gratitude against us. And I think those two issues in particular are something that I found particularly that I don't have to explain to adoptees at all, which is really, really refreshing, because even other people who have gone through a DNA surprise, some of them for other reasons as well, affairs, they don't tend to quite understand those issues, and it requires a lot of explaining.
You did. Yeah, and I just, to touch back on more the secrecy of it too, like, which sort of goes along with the legislation that we've been trying to pass. It's been really great for us to each be allies to one another. We were talking a little bit about how Texas passed the fertility fraud bill, which is where I first became acquainted with the donor conception community, was through Eve Wiley and her working toward getting that bill passed in Texas. And then we were working on the original birth certificate bill, and we were each able to be voices for the other issue when we were making rounds to the offices and so on and so forth. And we're there for each other during the hearing committees and the committee hearings. And that it was really great to know that there were others in the room, others in the building, that were going office to office with very similar messaging about how identity matters. And I loved Eve's hashtag genetic matter matters, because the messaging was so similar, and it was really helpful to have that bill moving through the legislature as we were trying to educate legislative aides on our issue. And I know, congratulations to Ohio, who just passed that same style of legislation due to Eve's efforts partnering with Adoption Network Cleveland. So it does feel like, on a bigger scale, not just on this, you know, one-to-one relationship that Cassandra and I have developed, but just on this bigger, grander scale of getting laws passed in these states, that the what do you call it, camaraderie that we forged is really going to benefit the communities overall, not just in peer support and those types of things, but also legislatively. And that's exciting to think about.
That it's really exciting to have people who understand those issues, the identity rights issue, and a group that has paved the way in so many ways for us to discuss that, because in many states, you know, that have done work on original birth certificates, you know, some of the legislators are familiar with some of those concepts, and it's really, really wonderful to have legislators who are at least have a passing familiarity with that concept. and it's also frustrating, you know, and I think so much of the work that the adoptee community has done has really inspired us. I mean, truly, even just the idea of being open with your child from the very beginning is something that has taken donor conception a few decades to catch up on, unfortunately. So we really have, you know, in large part, the adoptee community and adoptive parents, you know, who were intent on being truthful from the beginning, to thank for kind of paving that way and making it known that that was a healthier way to raise children, was to be honest from the very beginning, because we're still having to fight that fight now in 2023 to tell parents that telling their child they're donor conceived from the beginning is the right thing to do. And it may be shocking to a lot of people, but secrecy is still a huge problem in our community, often because it's only one parent, or because the you know, there are pictures of the pregnancy and things like that. It can be easier to hide, and so many parents still are doing that. So yeah, there's just so many ways, you know, legislatively and also just in you know, psychologically, reviewing psychology research on adoption, that your community has paved the way for us to start to make changes in the way the fertility industry works and in the way parents parent their donor conceived children.
Yeah, and you know, one of the stories I told when we were chatting about doing this talk is coming to mind, and that's it was a few summers before you and I got together, but I was at a family reunion, and I heard some relatives discussing a situation where a friend of a friend was, you know, had used a donor to start their family, and they were just chatting very casually about how no, they weren't going to be telling the child. And I'm sitting here listening to this, and they know that I'm active in adoptee rights. They know my feelings about transparency. And I was just shocked that like that this family that's been hearing me sort of get on my soapbox, you know, for years and years, was discussing this plan forward. And the donor conceived individual is still just an infant. So of course, you know, I had to say something. And I really felt like, coming from the adoptee perspective, that I was able to articulate some of the issues a little better than I would have been, you know, if I was just a random person, you know, overhearing this. So I really do feel like we can be each other's strongest allies in just when we're seeing these even individual situations where people think that that's the right course of action, that secrecy, and which I you know, it is hard to believe in this day and age that people are still moving forward with this idea that they can keep this stuff concealed. But it was so great to be able to use my knowledge and to advocate on behalf of this individual, just from the adoptee perspective.
Absolutely. And we so appreciate that, because I think, and that's where some of the, you know, misconceptions can come in. I think some people think that, you know, with donor conception, it's often just one side of the family, one parent that we aren't genetically connected to. Although things like double donation, which is when there's an egg donor and a sperm donor, are increasingly common, and embryo donation is often kind of blowing up right now, which is again, because of the political climate as well, when, you know, a couple is doing IVF with their own gametes and has leftover embryos, and those embryos can be adopted out to another family. So, you know, aside from those situations, but traditional just egg or sperm donation, you know, tends to just be one parent that we are severed from And so I think a lot of people perceive that to be, well, it doesn't really matter as much then, it's only one parent, so it's not so bad, something I say, and I say this as a parent myself, is, you're not pregnant with your child and then you can just like turn a switch and control, like, well, which parent do they get their looks from, and which parent do they get all these personality traits from? And we all know here we're not blank slates. So for a lot of donor conceived people, especially some who very keenly feel that loss or that disconnect, we're a lot like our biological parent that we were never supposed to meet. And so we do feel a lot of loss. And again, it's not the same. It's not the same as having both parents unknown, but it's definitely something where it's like, we don't want it to be minimized. It's not a case of trying to say whose situation is worse. And we can always appreciate that about adoptees, is that you understand that even having one parent that you've never met can really be traumatic as well. And, and we can try to empathize with the situations that you find yourselves in as well, because we understand how traumatic it can be. And kind of using our empathy to understand, really, to try to fathom what it's like to be in each other's shoes. And it's just, to me, it's so important to understand that, some of the differences in our situations can actually be stepping stones towards learning more about each other, and not putting one another down or separating us from one another, as far as, well, your situation is like this and yours is like this, so there's a big difference there. It's like, there may be that difference, but we need to understand what those differences are, because then we can advocate for one another like that in that situation. And it's a similar thing when we see parents talking so casually about adoption, how painful it is for donor conceived people to read cases of being separated from birth parents, separated from a culture of origin, separated from your country of origin. And it's all multiple types of grief and loss. And I think that's where the understanding comes in, is just understanding all the types of loss that we each experience in our communities.
Yeah, I think so, a good or something analogous to what you were saying is, even though I'm not a late discovery adoptee, my experience as an adoptee can give me that empathy. And I can never know what it's like to be a late discovery adoptee, but it doesn't make me any less of a peer to my community member, my adoptee community member. And so even though you may not be able to know what it's like to be completely disconnected from your parents, both sides, you can still have a better understanding than someone who isn't donor conceived, what it could be like to be adopted. So even though the experiences aren't exactly the same, there's still so many overlaps. And that does bring up, so many donor conceived people are late discovery. So I think that's a connection that a late discovery donor conceived person might actually have a better understanding to a late discovery adoptee than an adoptee who's known their entire life that they were adopted. So there's
Yes.
there's like those, what do you call those circles where there's overlap, you know,
Yes.
those diagrams, Venn diagram. So there's
Yes.
a lot of that
Actually, I
going
did a
on
Venn
between our communities. Yes, right.
Yes, I have a Venn diagram that I did, and I have a wonderful LDA friend who's on the call right now. I won't call her out, but she's a wonderful, wonderful person. Exactly, we have all bonded over that late discovery trauma because it's awful. It's awful. It adds another layer of complete betrayal. From the people who you were supposed to trust the most in life, your parents. And so, yeah, exactly. It's one of those things that even if you haven't experienced it, when you spend enough time in the groups with people who have, you can start to articulate what it's like and advocate for those people, you know, advocate why telling early is important because you've seen the results of not telling early, you know, just like I have seen the results from talking to so many people of, you know, domestic infant adoption. What are the effects of that? What are the effects of transracial adoption? What are the effects of intercountry adoption? And the more you talk with people who are from those backgrounds, the more you can say, if you come across those situations, either in the digital world or in real life, the more you can advocate for those people wherever you go, and speak up for them and start to change the narrative. Because I think that's something that we're all trying to do so much, is just change the narrative from that this is all a wonderful way to build your family to this is loss. This is first and foremost loss. And to gloss over the pain of it does a disservice to the adoptee or the donor conceived person throughout their lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. That was really well said, Cassandra. There was one other topic I wanted to make sure that we brought up, and I think that with the merging of these two communities, not all adoptees are merging with the donor conceived community. If you're not active in legislation or you're not, you know, involved in, you know, just things that are witness to the two communities merging, that's all well and good. But if you are choosing to engage in spaces where, or accept friend requests or broaden your circle to these environments where the two groups are coexisting, I think there is a responsibility, like you were saying, to educate yourself, to really talk to, listen to, read the voices of the other community. And so you're not, because, you know, because I'm not a donor conceived person, I don't want to slip into and accidentally, you know, promote a trope that I shouldn't be promoting, or, you know, share a meme that is inappropriate. Like, I want to make sure, since I have invited donor conceived people into my social circle, I want to make sure that I am being respectful, that I am being aware, that I am being, you know, I can't, my empathy goes so far, and then there's a space where I don't know the other person's experience. And so then I need to make sure that my education is making up for that space where I'm not aware of the experience. So I do think there's a burden on both communities as we merge, for each community member, if they're choosing to engage in these spaces, to really do the extra work of hearing those stories and vetting what we're sharing, and just being really aware in the spaces that we co-occupy, that we're supporting one another, not accidentally, you know,
Exactly.
yeah,
And
promoting
it's so true.
stereotypes and so forth. Yeah.
It's so true. And honestly, that's kind of how I came to adoption initially. Was I had a donor conceived friend who lived in a pretty rural area. And so she said she had been to an adoptee meetup because there were no donor conceived people near her. I live right outside of New York City, so I created a donor conceived meetup in New York City. There were a bunch of us, you know. But she said she had gone to an adoptee meetup and found a lot of commonalities. And I realized that some of the things that we were thinking as donor conceived people in our donor conceived only spaces were not being informed by the adoption community, because, when I found out I was donor conceived, what my mom said to me was, well, the doctor said there were 3 options. It was either use a sperm donor or adopt or not have children. So she's like, well, we figured it would be better to, be related to one of us. And a lot of donor conceived people would be like, well, maybe it would have been better if our parents just adopted, because there's all these orphans in the orphanage, the tropes that come up. And when I saw that in donor conceived communities, and it's not rampant, but I would see that issue come up of, is adoption preferable? I said, I started to think to myself, I need to look into this more, because we can't be promoting something, again, like you said as well. You can't be recommending, well, no, don't adopt, so why don't you use a donor instead, like that, like as if that will solve all the problems, because it brings in additional things. So I wanted to be sure that what we were doing as advocates, especially because I help moderate the largest constellation group as well. So I'm talking to parents every day as well. And, that's one of our forbidden statements in our group is, why don't you just adopt? First of all, because, no parent struggling with infertility wants to be told that either. But it's also extremely offensive to adoptees. And it's because we learned from the adoption community as well that's not an appropriate thing to say. And I wanted to make sure that our community was not saying anything like that, was not going to be promoting anything, because we have so much more in common than differences. And so I started to follow adoptees online. I started to read more and just read, not speak, just read and listen, until I felt like I could say, hey, there's a lot of problems here. There are insane ethical issues here. And if we want our ethical issues to be well understood, we need to understand these ethical issues, and we need to understand this type of loss and the gravity of this loss. And we cannot be in any way, shape, or form, if we are advocating for known donation and contact with all sides of genetic family, we cannot in good conscience speak about adoption without knowing the full ramifications of that. And then when, because I was born in New York, right across the river. And when the original birth certificate bill in New York passed a few years ago, I sat there and I was like, my goodness, I was born in New York. And it just like hit me that this was something that we needed to work on together. Like, we could not do this apart. We could not misunderstand one another. And the only way forward was to fully embrace all our commonalities. Because again, like I said, no one else understands the huge issues of commodification, and how much did your parents pay for you, and questions like that, and how that impacts you mentally and physically and psychologically, to deal with that, and the weight of being the solution to a parent's infertility issues. There's no one else who understands it the way your community does, and it just like drove me to be like, no, I need to understand all of this, all of these differences, and fight for everyone to understand this, everyone in my community, but even beyond, because it's so important, and it's not well understood in society. It's very much disenfranchised grief. So it's my
That's a great note to end on, Cassandra, really. I think that's really, I mean, that really sums it up nicely, the parallels between the two communities, and yeah, it's good stuff.
Well, thank you. I knew when I saw that Facebook post last summer that we were onto something, and I'm so glad to see this come to life. So, thank you so much, both of you, Marci and Cassandra. We did have a couple questions ahead of time, and I think that you answered the one about the LDA issues. There was also a question, are donor conceived people considered illegally adopted in terms of their non-biological parent listed on their birth certificate? That's,
No, it's a lot of us feel like our birth certificates are falsified, but legally in most places, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'm going based on what lawyers have said that I've heard speak about this. The person who gives birth is legally the mother. So in cases of an egg donor, and in cases of surrogacy, then there's other stuff that comes into play. But in cases of the egg donor, the birthing parent would be the legal mother. So that would not be considered falsified legally. And in most cases, like my parents were married when I was born. And so because my raising dad was married to my mom, he is legally presumed to be the father, even though everybody in the room knew he wasn't. So to me and to many donor conceived people, it feels like it was intentionally falsified because everybody knew that he was not the father. But legally, because they were married, it is not considered to be false, or the doctor kind of presented it to my mom as a half adoption situation, but they didn't have to go through an adoption situation. It's different for same-sex couples in many places who do have to go through a formal adoption situation, or choose to, in order to strengthen their parental rights. But no, it's not considered like a false birth certificate, even though, yeah, we kind of feel like it is.
Which is another parallel to the two groups,
Yeah.
because adoptees also oftentimes feel like their amended birth certificate, which is, a legal copy, is really the government falsifying. It's as my friend Don likes to say, it's a lie on paper. It's a lie
Yeah.
on paper. It's just like it's another point where we can kind of commiserate on that
Yeah.
sense of like the law is failing us. The law is failing us
And there
because
are
they
other
won't.
countries. Oh, go ahead. Yes.
No, go ahead. You go.
No, I was going to say, and there are other countries who do birth certificates differently. I believe Australia, when you turn 18, if you request a copy of your birth certificate, it is after the age of 18, it's annotated that you have more information about your birth, and that you're then allowed to, access the donor information, I believe, at least in Victoria, which has the kind of the world's most progressive donor conception legislation on the books. So there are places, and many places even here now are allowing more than two people to be put on birth certificates. So, in the long run, and this is probably going to be very difficult to do, but a lot of us would love to have all of our parents on the birth certificates, to have, or at least have the fact that we are donor conceived, to kind of prevent the lying, to prevent parents from holding that secret, because that's what's done in some other countries. So I don't know. It's a long way ahead here, but I think but some states are being more flexible about birth certificates, which is a good sign.
Well, and the laws are such as they are in Australia because of the hard work of that donor conceived community.
Exactly.
People advocating for decades for those changes in the law. So
good comment in chat that then we need to call them something other than birth certificates.
Right. It's like
So that
certificate of
reflect,
legal parentage,
Yeah.
like who is legally responsible for you? Well, that's okay, that's one thing, but who is my biological kin, and why are you hiding them from me with no ability to access, that information? The information from banks can be destroyed. The FDA doesn't have the FDA has like a 10-year limit or something. You can destroy records after that. It's ridiculous. There's and for people in my generation, and I was conceived and born in 1982. Most people my age do not know their donor. Most people my age who are donor conceived do not know that they are donor conceived still, because of the secrecy. But also people my age, there are no records unless you went through a sperm bank, which there are a few people my age who went to kind of the beginning stages of what sperm banks have become. But a lot of us were conceived in doctors' offices. It was doctors using their colleagues. They didn't keep records. They just, whatever sperm was lying around, and then you see cases like fertility fraud. It was, that's the environment that it grew up in, and that continued. That was happening up into the 80s, where it was just kind of whatever sperm was lying around to some degree.
I've heard stories that I think probably date to then too, of mixing sperm, using some of the husband's sperm so that he can think maybe that was his, so that nobody will ever know.
Yeah. And really the main thing that stopped some of that was the AIDS epidemic. There were some pockets of clusters of people who contracted HIV after insemination, and that required the containing and freezing and quarantining sperm so that they could retest it to make sure that it was the semen wasn't HIV positive. And that kind of led to the rise of these big cryobanks with frozen sperm that was being stored, where people could order it from a catalog and choose who they wanted and stuff, which is awful in another way because of the kind of commercialization of it. But in some ways, at least it led to some type of record keeping, because these were larger kind of conglomerates of businesses there. So, but it's all a mess. I mean, it's all a mess, whatever way you cut it. It's just a mess in different ways,
I thought it was interesting legislatively when we went to the Ohio legislature to look for a sponsor for the fertility fraud bill. Nobody was against it. No, I think for obvious reasons, but the legislators had a hard time believing that could even be an issue, that wasn't already illegal. And one of the things that got us across the finish line was the movie Our Father that came out, because then they were like, oh, okay, well, even though we had people coming and testifying that this happened to them, until you see it in black and white or in full color on Netflix, it was hard for them to even imagine.
Absolutely. And if you haven't seen Our Father yet, please do. Jacoba is a dear friend of mine, and she's been through a lot, and that is not the only case of that. And as I said, when I wrote up a testimony for the bill in Ohio, my situation was not like that. However, because of the time period, my parents were told things about who the donor was that were not exactly truthful, or what background he would be, or what, things like that were not truthful. And to people thinking that kind of stuff can't happen now. I mean, things like IVF mix-ups, and sperm mix-ups, people ordering sperm from who they think of, one donor, and or donors lying on their forms and being someone who they are not truly. All these things are still still problems, and need the protection of law to make sure that for the health of everybody involved, for the health of the recipient parents as well. It's I spend a lot of time talking to parents, and I definitely empathize with their struggles as well. But so as adoptees know, the burden ends up falling squarely on the child created or the child born to kind of deal with the ramifications of how screwed up their conception was, or and how it came to be.
We tried to make sure that we covered as much of that as possible in the bill that we got passed. So beyond the doctor using his own sperm, cases where they volitionally told parents something that wasn't true about the donor. I don't think it covers like a medical malpractice mistake if they use the wrong sample by mistake. But when doctors could have known or should have known or did know, and did something volitionally.
Well, and that just draws on another parallel too, because with so many adoptees, when we do finally uncover our stories, turns out we weren't adopted to a lawyer and a doctor, like we weren't, the adoptive parents weren't the fictional folks that were described on paper. They were a completely different set of parents than what if the relinquishing parents were given information on or given an opportunity to express where they wanted their child to land. So much of that information was fictionalized by, especially in the era of closed adoption. So it just sort of draws on another parallel of that deception that goes on within the two different communities, and how it does land. I mean, we are the ones who ultimately live that out.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've had some friends who were egg providers who sold their eggs, who identify very much with and have found community in the community of first mothers as well, even though it's a very there are again huge differences there, but have found some validation there. And that's another thing too, is when you talk about relinquishing parents having an idea of who the adoptive parents will be, that's not accurate. And of course, that there being that coercion, of course, too, for a lot of relinquishing parents, a lot of it is also not really educating the gamete donors about what the consequences of their actions will be. And a lot of them think that they're very, the people who are trying to do it a good thing and aren't, doing it for the money, although, I'm sure that doesn't hurt for a lot of them. But, a lot of them are very naive in thinking that, unfortunately, that, they're just donating to these amazing families who want children. And of course, some of them may be, but as a lot of donor conceived people can tell you, being donor conceived and having your parents want a child very badly that they're willing to pay, does not always mean that you are going to be a great parent. There are a lot of donor conceived people who were, raised in abusive homes, and I don't know that that a lot of donors are aware of that when they donate. They're really thinking also the rosy picture that this child is going to be raised in a perfect home, and it's often is not always that way.
Well, and the parents are probably dealing with a bunch of unresolved grief around the fact that they've had to go that route, which again, hate to keep saying it, but there's another parallel. So yeah, so there's so many overlaps, and it feels like, we're running out of time here, but you can see how the conversation can just continue. And the communities hopefully will continue to, rally to each other. I was so excited to be able to submit testimony on the bill in Ohio as well. And I submitted from my adoptee perspective. I was able to empathize just given my experience as an adoptee. And I would really encourage folks, even in the states where maybe original birth certificate access is passed, go ahead and chime on that donor conception bill. And vice versa, where the donor conception bills are passing, go ahead and chime in on those original birth certificate bills, because we know, like, the more voices, the better, and especially the more folks that live in that state that are calling for change, the better. So it's a really great coming together and allyship in terms of passing legislation.
Yeah, we all know what it's like to have unethical business practices going on regarding us. And we all know what it's like to have information about who we are, information about our bodies locked away by doctors or psychologists or a social worker or who knows who, literally there, and we're not able to access that information about ourselves. And that's what's so powerful about speaking with adoptees, is just understanding how insane that is, and how deeply, deeply on a physical level, how deeply traumatic that is. And to have the people who are so close to us in our lives, our immediate family, kind of be in on that, that hiding of our information, even if we were told, even people who were told when they were young, having our parents be in on that idea of that information being something we can't access, how frustrating that is, and how painful that is.
As we start to wrap up, I just want to invite, we threw around a lot of terminology this evening. And for anybody who might be newer to some of these discussions, or even people that have been around these discussions for a while, there very likely might have been terms that you weren't familiar with. And so don't be shy. If there's anything that's lingering for you that you don't understand or haven't figured out what it meant, please feel free to ask. This is a good time to do that.
I have a question
Okay.
for Cassandra. How do you feel about having a known donor?
So that's kind of what we're advocating for as best practices currently. However, because it's a crazy world, there is a subset of known donors who are known prolific serial donors, where they make not a living, but that's what they do, is they donate sperm to dozens of families, and it's just as harmful as a bank. So what we advocate for in known donation is someone that someone who is only who will be able to be involved in the child's life to some extent. It doesn't have to be a raising parent, although of course that's that's the next step, but someone who can provide that genetic mirroring for the child, someone who's available to ask health questions, just be available for that child, and also not have 100 other known donation kids out there. So I know it's
well, to interject, in a perfect world, I wish that was so, but I'm an adoptee who found out, in a traumatic way, like on a playground, from another kid that I was adopted. And so I grew up not knowing, and I'm a lesbian also, and I wanted a child. So I had a baby through a donor, and it's a known donor, and it's not a perfect way. Yes, I wish I had known someone who could have been there and maybe, helped raise him, but that wasn't possible. So at 18, at least he knew more than I did, actually.
yes.
Hopefully it's the
Yes.
right, we've also met some of his donor siblings.
Oh, that's great. That's another thing too, is the number of siblings we can have is just can be astronomical. But yeah, it's not an easy place to navigate. That's why I love listening to parents and how they're navigating the system also, because it's not easy. And yeah, that's the thing too, is being being connected with donor siblings can kind of help with that issue that was just put in the chat of possibly meeting unknown siblings, dating unknown siblings. So basically the more connections, the better. And, as things change, I mean, things are not always possible for every family at a given time, but we're just trying to kind of slowly kind of plant the idea for people that we can continue making changes as we go along, and that people will do the best they can in whatever situation. So it sounds like you did absolutely the best you can, and that you can empathize with your child, which is the biggest gift also, because I think we all maybe can understand what it's like to not have your parents understand what you're going through as an adoptee or a donor conceived person. And so at least having that shared experience, that empathy to be able to understand is definitely powerful.
Thank you.
Any last question before we end? Okay. Well, you guys covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much. Really informative discussion. I'll put a plug in. We have a DNA support group through Adoption Network Cleveland, and so does AKA. So you can contact Marci about one. You can take a look at our website, aka.org, right? Or
It's
adoptionknowledgeaffiliates.org.
adoptionknowledgeaffiliates.org.
Okay. And adoptionnetwork.org. So if you're looking for that type of support. Also, our general support and discussion meetings are open to anyone, so you don't have to be part of the adoption constellation. You could also be part of the donor conceived constellation and come to those. So thank you, Marci. Thank you, Cassandra. This was really informative and thoughtful, and very much appreciate the discussion.
Well, thank you for your vision, Betsy. I have to say, thank you for your vision, because this was really it was really eye-opening even for me. I mean, every time I listen to Cassandra, I learn more. And so I appreciate you giving us the opportunity.
Thank you. I've just been thrilled in the last several years to watch the communities, join more and discover more about each other and network.
Yeah, it makes me so happy to do joint events, because I love connecting with people. I love hearing people's stories and learning from their stories, and also learning from what they've learned, because there's so much love and wisdom to share about how we make it through whatever background we have in this community.
Thanks. I did put a quick survey in chat. We do like feedback about our program, so if it's just a few questions, if you can take a minute to fill that out. Everybody will get a thank you email for coming. The survey link will be in that as well as a couple books that Marci and Cassandra recommended while we were chatting ahead of time. And as I think most people know, Adoption Network Cleveland is a small nonprofit organization, membership based. You can learn more about that at our website. We'd welcome everybody's membership, and very much appreciate you being here and supporting our program tonight. So thank you. Good night.